Hello, everyone, and welcome. Great to have such a global audience at our webinar today. My name is Rika Adnan, and I'm the Senior Business Developer at World Data Lab. And to kick it off, I will shortly do an introduction of World Data Lab, who we are, what do we do, and after I do that, I will hand over to our thought after expert, Dr. Homi Kharas, who will then address our topic of the day: where do we stand with ending global poverty by 2030? Next slide, please. So what do we do at World Data Lab? Our mission is to make everyone count. And we do that by developing very granular economic and demographic forecasts at any point in time on a very global scale. And we're able to do that because we're able to map the whole world, so almost every single country. And perfect, thank you. I see that the slide changed as well. And we predict their economic and demographic changes in the upcoming years. We work together with private companies and with public institutions and policymakers, and we'll definitely consider ourselves to be really at the forefront of data science. On the next slide, you already see that we are addressing very different SDGs. So we're big at working the field of SDGs and with SDGs. And as today, I already said, our topic will be around poverty. So SDG number 1, and we'll look into where do we stand with ending poverty around the globe. And how we do that is we call them clocks. So we look at how many people live in poverty at the moment and how does that number change. Obviously now this year strongly affected by the impact of COVID-19. So how many people are escaping poverty every minute as we talk, and how many are now maybe also slipping back and entering poverty again. Now, this is not the only tool that we have built. As you can see on the slide, we're addressing different SDGs. So we have recently actually launched the World Hunger Clock that I'm going to talk to about in a second. But also we're working on models to SDG number 3, SDG number 4, so around health and education. And you can look at all of them online. So we put them online, so you're always able to keep up to date and keep track with how we're doing globally on addressing these SDGs. Next slide, please. Here's just a short overview for you on to be able to picture when I talk about we're building clocks, what does that mean? So as you can see, for example, on the World Poverty Clock, so the data that we're going to talk about today and the insights that we're going to share today are also available online that you can really just log on and check it out. That's also true for the water scarcity clock, the hunger clock, etc. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give you an insight. So we put together a little video on how it looks like. So you can really just type in, for example, for the World Hunger Clock, you type in worldhunger.io, and you can go onto the map, onto the global map, look at the different countries, zoom in, get an idea of how many people on the one hand are how many children are affected by stunting and how many people live in moderate or severe food insecurity. And as you can see, you can see that for today, so for 2020, but you're also able to look into the future, to look at 2025 of how that will change, in 2030 as well. Again, this is live right now. We have launched in October, so you can always go onto the website and see for yourself. Next slide, please. So I think there's nothing else for me left to do than to introduce the expert for today. Many of you already know him for his great involvement in the development of the SDGs. And right now, he's a senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institute. And we're super lucky to also have him as a senior economic advisor at the World Data Lab. And I would like to introduce to you Dr. Homi Kharas. Please take it over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reka, and let me spend the next few minutes talking a little bit about global poverty trends, and I'll say a little bit about how COVID has and the economic response to COVID has affected those trends. So the first thing I wanted to just explain is how do we actually arrive at these trends? What we do is we try to model the entire population of the world in terms of their income level. So just think about everyone in the world ordered by their income into these different thresholds. So if you're in a family that, in essence, spends between 0 and $1.90 per person per day, uh, then you're considered to be extremely poor. And as you go up the income scale, you enter into different classes. We call people above $11 per day essentially middle class. And more or less, if you put everybody in the world onto a chart like this, you'll get a graph that looks something like this. The y-axis is the number of people in each of these buckets. And this is what allows us, when we say this is how many people are poor, what we're talking about is all of the people who are in this red triangle on the left-hand side. And what's going to happen is that over time, as there's growth in individual countries, this graph shifts to the right, and the number of people in poverty tends to fall. That's if there's growth. Of course, what we're going to see is that this year, because there's been negative growth, the graph is actually going to shift to the left, and we're going to get more people in poverty. So where are we today? On SDG 1, which has this definition that it's trying to eradicate extreme poverty, defined as those people in families that are spending less than $1.90 per person per day. And so for 186 countries in the world, and the world population is about 7.7 billion people today, we have, in our estimate, something like 759 million people in extreme poverty, and that's up from 660 million people in 2019. So an increase of almost 140 million people as a result of COVID. Now, I did also want to say that when we talk about extreme poverty, it's a single line applied everywhere in the world, but SDG 1 also asks every country to try to halve the amount of poverty under their own national poverty line. And you can see we don't have the worldwide distribution of this, but for 72 countries with about just over 3 billion people, so about just under half of the world's population, you already have 873 million poor people under that definition. So more poor people, even though we're only covering half of the world. So you can see that the population under the national poverty line may be 2, maybe even 3 times higher than the absolute poverty figure. And what we have, and what I'm going to tell you towards the end of the presentation, is right now we estimate that we have 318 million people, poor people, living in countries which are absolutely off track and moving in the wrong direction in terms of achieving SDG 1. Another 230, by 2030, another 239 million people who are in countries that are off track, and then a few people living in countries where actually poverty reduction is really going quite well. So what do we have with global poverty? First, we see that it was, before COVID, we were on a reasonably nice trajectory where poverty was falling. By 2019, it had fallen to 661 million. We were all looking at this chart and the way in which poverty was coming down and really hoping that that trend line would continue. And instead, this is what has happened. Poverty has shot up. And now we're at 759 million people. That's 98 million people more than where it was before. And if you think of where it would have been if the trend had continued, the pre-COVID trend had continued, we'd be talking about something upwards of 140 million people. And then what you see by our forecasts afterwards is that that trend reduction line starts to move just as it did before. So COVID is almost like a long-lasting shock. It's not one of these things that you have it, and then once we're able to have the vaccinations and COVID disappears, that we'll get back to the world as we knew it before, and we will get back to the previous trend line. We'll simply be reestablishing a new trend line. So we think that in 2021 and then 2022, poverty will start to come back down, but it's actually at quite a bit slower rate. And so for the next 2 years, we'll only have 56 million fewer people in poverty. So even in 2 years, we won't have taken care of the almost 100 million increase that we saw as a result of COVID. And in fact, it's going to take us considerably longer to do that. And the rate of poverty decline is slowing over time. So after we have this recovery from COVID, we'll enter hopefully into a period of growth for the world, and poverty will start to come down, but it'll actually start to come down quite slowly. And I'll go into some reasons for that. So when you look at where we were and the trend that we were on, and then you look at where we seem to be today and hopefully the future trend, in our estimation, we've probably lost about 5 years in our efforts to end poverty. And if you think that the SDG timeframe now ends in 2030, that means we've basically lost half of the period. So from 2020 to 2025, we'll still be pretty much where we thought we would be coming into 2020. So we've literally lost half of the time available in this UN Decade for Action to really bring down poverty. Now, I think it's important to understand that the way in which COVID has affected global poverty really differs by region. And we've broken out those numbers so that you see that the big impact is in South Asia. And within South Asia, the big impact is in India, which has been very seriously affected indeed. And we estimate that there are probably 45 million more poor people in India, another 37 million more poor people in Africa, and then the impact on poverty in the rest of the world is comparatively small, and it's comparatively small because the absolute numbers of poverty starting off in those regions were also quite small, and most of those people are living quite far above the poverty line, so that even though they're not brought down into extreme poverty, they are still quite seriously affected. And here I just want to refer back to my earlier observation about the difference between extreme poverty and national poverty. These numbers are all about people falling into extreme poverty. But in Latin America, for example, you may well have many, many more people falling into poverty as defined in their own countries. So here you see the kind of the global map and trajectory. And what you see is that the size of each of these circles represents the total amount of poverty. So the world was doing quite nicely in reducing poverty between the year 2000 and 2020. You see that circle shrinking. But from 2020 to 2030, the rate of reduction is much, much smaller, and poverty is increasingly concentrated in Africa, and the share of South Asia kind of continues to shrink as the share of Africa goes up. So another way of looking at poverty is, again, to disaggregate it even further into the country trends. And what you see here is that in Asia, most Asian countries are actually doing quite well in bringing poverty down. And even India, which is the country in Asia with the most poverty, had been quite successful up until COVID. And you see that big shock to India. But then the pattern of poverty reduction in India which has been historically growing quite rapidly, starts to revert, and poverty in India starts to fall again by 2030, and India does quite well. So that's the kind of the typical Asian pattern, but it's not true everywhere. And I do want to highlight that there are countries in Asia, like Afghanistan, like North Korea, like Papua New Guinea, where the rate of reduction in poverty is quite small. It's sometimes even growing. And there are still quite a few people in these countries. So in Afghanistan, for example, we're probably going to be talking somewhere around 16, 17 million people in poverty. In North Korea, also well over 10 million people in poverty, even by 2030. So when we do these broad generalizations about where poor people are, it's important to recognize that there are quite important differences within regions. And that's equally true in Africa. I said before that many of the poorest people are in Africa, and that's true in many of the African countries, and in some countries like Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have far and away the most poor people in Africa in absolute terms. So in terms of just the number of poor people, you see the impact of COVID, and you see that even after COVID is over, because their populations continue to grow and grow more rapidly than their gross domestic product and their income levels, there is a strong likelihood that under current trajectories and business as usual, poverty will still continue to rise in Nigeria and the DRC, and indeed in some of the other African countries. And you can see quite a few African countries clustered around poverty levels of somewhere around 20 million people. But then you also have countries like Ethiopia, where poverty is on a very significant downward trend within Africa. So uh, you put all of this together. Sometimes we talk about, well, which countries are, the countries with the most poor people in the world. And for a short period of time, it was Nigeria. Now with COVID, India is back as the new quote unquote champion of global poverty. But you can also see that within a couple of years, numbers of poor people in India will again fall below the number of poor people in Nigeria, and that will bring us back to where we were before. These new and old charts simply represent updates. There are also constant updates. In addition to COVID, there are constant updates to the statistical base that allow us to compute how many poor people there are in each of these countries. Nigeria has just had a brand new survey, and from that survey, we can infer that there are actually far fewer people living in poverty in Nigeria than we had thought before. So what we estimate is that when we look at this country by country, we'll still have something like 61 countries that are off track to meet the SDG targets. The reason why we don't have the numbers for all of the 61, these are the countries that are red and yellow. You see we have 21 countries in red and 39 countries, and then in brackets we have +1. That +1 is Syria. We know that Syria is off track. We just have no real understanding of the dimensions of poverty in Syria. So rather than trying to guess a number, we've simply excluded it from the country totals. But you can see very large numbers in Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then several other countries with poverty rates between 15 to 20 million people, even by 2030. And what we've done is we've identified in this chart also those countries which have some experience of conflict in some or all portions of the countries. So it's in northeast Nigeria, in DRC, we've had frequent conflict, also in Angola, in South Sudan. So you can see that one of the big drivers of poverty, which has been exacerbated by COVID, but where COVID is not the only cause of poverty, is actually conflict. Now, I think it's also important that we not think of poverty just in terms of which countries, but also in terms of where in those countries. So if you take a country like Kenya, which did not appear in our list above as one of the countries with the highest numbers of poor people, the core of Kenya, where most people live, is actually doing quite well. But if you look just at the northeast part of Kenya, what's in this slightly orange triangle in the map that I have here, that sparsely populated area, you still have close on half of all people in that living in that area, living in extreme poverty. So it's really important as we think about poverty to understand that you have to drill down within countries to really understand where poor people are. And just looking at these headcount numbers doesn't tell you the whole story about what's happening to poverty in the world. So let me just close now with a few messages. We, I think, now feel that the magnitude of the COVID shock, both in terms of the size of the recession that's been generated in so many countries and the number of countries that are experiencing a recession this year, almost 90% of all countries, has meant that COVID-19 has been the greatest shock to fight poverty, certainly in this century. And more than 98 million, 100 million people more are living in extreme poverty. But the biggest increase in poor people has actually been in Asia, a region which we have not been talking about that much in terms of poverty reduction, except in talking about its success. And of course, COVID has also had a big impact on poverty in Africa, which is the more traditional story of poverty reduction. But in Asia, our estimate is that the poverty shock will be short-lived, and the places in Asia which are suffering from the recession induced by COVID will start to recover and poverty will start to fall again, while the poverty shock in Africa will last longer and in some places not be reversed because their income levels are not actually growing rapidly. The other final message I would say is that we think that the speed of poverty reduction will remain slow in the future, and we project that almost 600 million people will still be living in extreme poverty, and the vast bulk of those, perhaps 500 million, will be living in Africa by 2030. So many of these underlying causes, including conflict, that are driving poverty won't be solved just because we have the vaccinations to be able to do something about COVID-19. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear Homi, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really insightful, and we already have a lot of questions in. So people are super excited to have you with us today and to be able to dig a bit deeper into the topics that you shared with us and discussed with us. And there are several, but maybe we start on a bit more on a high level note, and then we zoom into some of the questions a bit more. So we from World Data Lab had another webinar in spring when we, COVID first hit, let's say globally, and we saw the first impacts that COVID had on especially SDG number 1 on eliminating poverty and how it changed the projections. Now, what would you say, what is like the biggest difference between when we looked at the numbers then and now, and understanding a bit more about COVID-19?
So I think that we now have a better understanding of what's happening to economic growth in the world. We have some actual data. Some very large countries like India in particular had a huge collapse in their economic growth in the second quarter of this year as they established a lockdown to try to deal with COVID. We saw a lot of international capital flows starting to seize up. And so I think that now the news in some places is much worse, but I would say that in other places the news is slightly better. So we had worried early, the World Bank had a projection, they had a forecast that remittances, which many poor households rely on to keep themselves out of poverty, would fall by 20%. That was the World Bank forecast for what would happen to remittances in 2020 compared to 2019. In October, the World Bank updated that and said, actually, we now think it's going to be close to a 7% fall. So you can see that these numbers are changing very rapidly, very fast, and they're very big numbers. And so the effect on poverty can be quite considerable as we start to get new information. I would underline here that because so many things have changed with COVID, both in terms of people's income levels and in terms of government's policy responses and who exactly is benefiting from those responses, that it's not that easy to be very precise about what is happening to poverty. So much of what I've said today about the short run is our estimates. It's a little bit of this is what we think, but really shouldn't be taken as being something where we have a tremendous amount of confidence. And I'm sure these numbers will change as we get more data about what's actually happening on the ground in different countries. But I'm much more confident in the longer term trends because many of those trends we already see will not be changed that much by COVID. So the demographic trends don't get changed that much by COVID-19. And some of the conflict trends, as I mentioned, some of the trends on weather and what's going to happen to agricultural productivity, all of which go into these forecasts of what's going to happen to poverty by 2030.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at what's going to happen to poverty, can we maybe say that, is there at some point, do we bounce back to pre-COVID-19, or do these lines always stay parallel in terms of, this was how we projected poverty to be reduced until 2030, now COVID hit, and this is how it's gonna be reduced, or do these numbers ever align again to pre-COVID times?
So I think this very much depends on whether you're talking about the aggregate, the global aggregates, or country by country. At the global aggregate level, I would say these lines never cross. We've had a big shock to poverty, and we are not going to be able to recoup that in the very short to medium term. So the new path of global poverty is always going to be above what the old path was. There may be individual countries where actually the impact on poverty actually disappears after a relatively short period. And so the lines will tend to converge after a period of time. So that's the case in some countries which were relatively unaffected by poverty. But I should also say, just as I was saying earlier on, that things are a little confused. Even the data that we have is a little confused because you can imagine that collecting data and information by many national statistical offices is seriously affected by COVID-19. I mean, people can't go out and do surveys in the same way as they did before. So we also have to worry just about the quality of the data. We take it for granted that when a government statistical office says this is what's happened to GDP, that it's quote unquote right, but actually they have tremendous difficulty in making these estimations if they can't put people in the field.
Absolutely. And actually, there is one question that goes a bit in that direction because it asks a bit of how you used these trend lines and these estimations. It's asking Oh, sorry, just jumped one. Could you explain more about the assumptions regarding income distribution? What evidence on trends on Gini, Palama Index, etc., were used? So could you elaborate on that a bit?
So more or less, it differs a little bit from country to country, depending on where we have data. So in some places we have good data, and we separately estimate rural poverty and urban poverty. In other places, we have data by state at the subnational level, and we can use that to try to build up our estimates. What we try to do is the changes in distribution, I think, also depend very heavily on demographics. And so as if you have, for example, a lot of older people in your population who aren't earning or spending that much, you might tend to have a different kind of distribution from a distribution where most people are in the working age and earning a wage. In the latter kind of country, the distribution is heavily dictated by labor market outcomes, and so it just depends on how much people earn. In the former case, where you've got a lot of old people, the distribution is really affected by government policy towards pensions, just to give you one example. So what we do is we do look at the way in which the changing age structure of the population will affect income distribution over time, and we factor that into our projections for 2030.
And if you look at what sort of benchmarks we use, we have one question directed towards, is the $2 or $1.9 benchmark still the right one to use? As should we worry more also about the $2 to $10 threshold and people living in that threshold, just because then poverty would be more alarming? What would you say to that?
So, we are not really choosing one benchmark over another. The United Nations under the SDGs has selected a certain metric. That's the metric that we're focused on. We started the presentation talking about SDG 1. So this is the definition that's being used. And I think we can say that it's useful not to forget the national poverty line definition, which is also an SDG target. And I didn't spend a great deal of time talking about it, but I did introduce it at the beginning of my remarks. And as I said, there you have many, many more people who are living in poverty. So from a policy point of view, if you want to think about national policy, every nation has decided on what their poverty line is, and therefore the people that they are most concerned about. From a global point of view and an international policy point of view, we've decided on $1.90 as being the core threshold.
And the next question would follow a bit on that, but I would take it a bit more in a political direction. So feel free, to phrase it in a sense of how we, from a data perspective, can answer to that. Because it's asking, if poverty is a personal or structural problem, in the sense of, the reduction of poverty goes really slow. So who is actually taking profit of that being so slow, and who is responsible actually to making it, to speed it up?
Well, sometimes there is profit and sometimes there is not. So let me say that in countries that are affected by conflict, and I showed in one of the charts how many of the countries with very large numbers of people living in extreme poverty are affected by conflict. In those places, it's not a fight over profit. It's really just a fight about different experiences, different conditions, different powers associated with different groups of people within that country. There is no profit, to be perfectly blunt, in these countries. So they're very much struggling over the division of the pie rather than about growing the pie. as it were. And that's a very different problem from the problem that one sees in other places where there may be some profit. In many natural resource exporting countries, there's considerable amounts of profit. And there it is both a matter of how do we actually get more profit through the exploitation of these resources, and how do we make sure that there is an adequate governance so that the distribution of that profit across everyone in society is perceived to be fair.
Mhm. Can we maybe put that into an example? I saw that you had on one chart, you were talking about how I believe it was Ethiopia was going down versus Nigeria still rising. So could you maybe give us an example of one country where that could be the case?
So there are many things that have been done in Ethiopia, but I would say a few things really stand out. Ethiopia has invested very heavily in its economy, in its economic growth. So they've invested in the production of energy, and sometimes very controversially, there are very controversial new hydropower dams in Ethiopia, but that is the source of the energy that's powering their economy. They've invested in new industrial zones, they've invested in manufacturing, and they've invested in people and institutional structures and social assistance for the poorest people. And what's really interesting, I didn't talk about the way in which COVID-19 has also driven a huge hunger crisis across the world. And part of that hunger crisis is in the Horn of Africa. And in some places, we see that translating immediately into real issues with poverty and the most extreme forms of poverty, which is literally famine and hunger. In places like Ethiopia, you don't see that because the government has a fairly effective social safety net, and they've been able to, in some sense, compensate people for their loss of livelihoods stemming from COVID. So they've got structures in place to do that. Contrast that with Nigeria, where partly because of the conflict that has been prevalent in the Northeast in particular, they've not really had the same kind of investment either in incomes or in safety nets in those places. And so those places uh, are still really deep pockets of poverty and numbers of poor people.
Mm-hmm. I see. I mean, the following question might already be answered with that answer. I just want to maybe you want to add something else to it. As somebody's asking, would you agree that the African scenario has more to do with fellow man, that it's more fellow man-made than it has anything to do with natural calamities? If you want to add anything else to that.
Yes, of course, the two, in some sense, go together. It's much easier to be active if you have the resources and the wealth to actually do something good. So you certainly see in Africa, subject to many of the same kind of natural disasters. I gave the example of Ethiopia. It's not the only country in Africa which is growing rapidly and reducing poverty. You see other cases like Rwanda, for example, and several other cases elsewhere on the continent. So clearly, one can succeed in Africa. There's nothing intrinsic about the continent that dooms it to poverty. Some of the people who have said your geography dictates whether or not you're going to be poor, I certainly don't subscribe to those kinds of uh, assumptions or conclusions. But equally, it's a tremendous challenge to be able to bring yourself out of poverty. And Africa is facing many problems at the same time. It faces problems of low agricultural yields, so it doesn't have a great surplus. It has to import a lot of food. It faces problems of not being well connected with global supply chains and therefore not having the same kind of advantages to growth and incomes of trade, both between Africa and the rest of the world and even within Africa. Distances are very large in Africa. They don't have the physical connectivity through ports. Shipping costs are very high if you want to take goods from Africa somewhere else. So you've got a lot of disadvantages that have to be tackled.
Mm-hmm.
And then overlaid on that are all of the issues about conflict between different groups of people, in some instances, governance problems. We've heard many stories about illicit financial flows. Much of the money in Africa leaves the continent. There was a famous case of Isabel dos Santos earlier in the year, with literally billions of dollars taken out of Africa and parked in tax havens across the world. So there are many structural problems that African countries have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. And if we zoom out of Africa again and take it to a global level, there are a lot of questions in the direction of COVID-19 obviously being now a big shock to the efforts of eradicating poverty. But what about other impacts such as climate change, etc.?
So I think climate change for sure is one of the things that we need to worry about a lot. I was starting to make the link between poverty and food insecurity. And one of the biggest effects of climate change will be on the livelihoods of people in rural areas and the impact on yields in those areas. Climate change is a fairly slow moving thing, so we won't see the shock in the same way as COVID as a big increase in poverty, except when it results in a specific natural disaster, whether that's a major drought or a flood or something like that. But one of the things we're actually getting better at is predicting climate and using big data and big analytics to be able to warn farmers of what is happening. And so hopefully that will mitigate to a certain degree the effect of climate change on productivity decreases. And at the same time as we have climate change as a negative force, we have a lot of technology and information as a positive force, which is still driving up yields. And in much of Africa, they still have tremendous potential to increase crop yields by using modern seeds and by using improved farming practices.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe then that question would fit really nicely here also, because somebody's asking to what extent should this market-driven paradigm be integrated with principles of social responsibility, if at all?
Oh, I think hugely that, we've come to understand that all stakeholders have a responsibility for sustainable development in its broadest sense. And the broad sense of sustainable development is that it incorporates environmental, social, and governance aspects. And so whether you're a small business or a large corporation operating anywhere in the world, you really do need to think through all of those elements in terms of your business practices if you're going to be successful. And thankfully, what we've found is that adoption of these kinds of principles doesn't run counter to a capitalist or a market economy. If anything, the companies that really embrace ESG principles do better from a financial profit point of view than the companies that don't, certainly over the long run. So we don't have to completely change our market economies in order to embrace these principles. What we do need to do is change our standards of governance and our sense of what is an appropriate norm and shared responsibilities within society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And could we assume, or could we say that the charts that you showed us on how countries are now doing in terms of being affected of COVID-19 and in terms of their works towards eradicating poverty, could we also say that those countries, that it's kind of a reflection of how resilient they were and how good they dealt with COVID-19, if they are still on track, or would that be a false causation?
No, I think that that's right, and it's not just resilience towards COVID-19. It's resilience to all kinds of different shocks, and so one of the things we've seen, for example, is that countries that have already embraced digital technologies and have government services delivered digitally, in particular social assistance, have been able to transfer money directly to families that have been really most severely affected. And that's really proven to be valuable, not just for the people themselves, but also for sustaining the local economies in the places where they live. And so, those areas are being kept afloat by these kinds of government policies, and whether that's direct cash transfers, whether it's loans to small and medium businesses, other kinds of guarantees, making sure that the banking system is strengthened. All of these kinds of things are part and parcel of resilience. And what I see as being one of the bright spots, if you will, of the post-COVID world is that many more governments will start to understand that this is a real priority. We have to build resilience into everything that we do. And one of the best ways of building resilience is really to embrace the digital economy, and not just in terms of the way in which the private sector works and operates, but also the way in which governments work and operate. And to do that, you need to have the infrastructure. So I would imagine that there'll be many more countries looking very seriously about how do we make sure that we have broadband access for everyone in this country as a matter of high national economic priority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, Homi, I'm just aware of the time as well, and there's still many questions coming in. We still have many that were asked. I would say I would pick the last two, max three, to then also slowly that we come to a wrap up. So one would be along the lines, I've already touched upon that before, the national poverty lines. Somebody's asking, are you planning to carry out a similar exercise with that metric?
We will try. What we need to do, and what slows up the process, of course, is that we actually need to find the national poverty line, and they keep changing, and make sure that we've got the most up-to-date one for close to 200 countries if we're going to do it on a global scale. So we've started, and you saw in the slide that we've now got up to some 70 or so. But if anybody on this call would send us information and say, in my country, this is our national poverty line, it would be a great help to us, and it would help us to accelerate the process. But what I'm really saying is that this is something that has to be done country by country, and that makes it a very painstaking and slow process compared to taking a global consistent number, and then we can just use algorithms to do all of the estimations based on that, and do it mechanically rather than individually. So that's one reason why all of our efforts using the national poverty line have lagged behind our efforts using the global poverty line.
Mm-hmm. And one question is also still going in the direction of the methods and methodology used behind it, saying that obviously demographic changes in urban rural are more medium and long term, versus the impact of COVID was very short run, and it's not same for every person. And it's asking how was that dealt with? So like the changes in this medium long run versus COVID, which is such a short hit.
So we really look at the COVID impact not so much in terms of its health impact as much as in terms of its economic impact. And so the way in which the impact of COVID on poverty is translated into our modeling techniques is first to see how is COVID-19 and the government policy response leading to new estimates. And we don't make these estimates. We just take the estimates from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and we use their assessments of economic growth in these countries. So how has COVID-19 affected those? And then we use that to say, if you accept those assumptions, how is this going to translate into poverty in the short run? The longer term trends, these are things where we can have much more confidence. So, we certainly, if you want to know how many people are going to be entering into the working age, defined as, say, something like 15 to 65 years old over the next 10 years, well, we know because all the kids between the age of 5 and 15 in 10 years will be above that 15-year threshold, and all the older people from 55 to 65 will be outside of that window. So we can track quite closely and accurately what's going to be happening to the working age over a 10-year period, say, because we already know how many people there are in each of these age categories.
Mhm, mhm. Perfect. And I'm trying to combine two questions here on a bigger level, on a bigger meta scale, let's put it that way. Because obviously there's so much happening in the world. We have seen different movements from the Black Lives Matter movement, climate change, etc. And the person is asking if people still care about poverty. Like, is it still in the heads there? Is it still in the policy making on the desk of policymakers? And is it something that also, quote unquote, people can make a difference, people who fight to eradicate poverty, or is it more on a governmental institutional level?
Oh, I think it's absolutely on a personal level. One of the reasons why governments and institutions care about poverty is because people care about poverty. And so I think that all of us really need to fight hard. And one of the whole reasons why we actually constructed this tool of the poverty clock was to give some ammunition for people to be able to say to policy leaders, this is what's happening to poverty in our country, please do something about it. And that is the foundation of all policy towards poverty. And it's urgent now because there are so many other priorities. I mean, COVID-19 means that governments have to worry about health, and climate change means that governments have to worry about carbon emissions. And biodiversity means that governments have to worry about conservation. And Black Lives Matter means that governments have to worry about social inclusion. So there are lots of priorities in the world, and we have to be sure that poverty doesn't just fall off the policy radar screen. That's one of the reasons why we have the tool. It's a real threat in our view. Poverty is actually fundamental to all of the other issues that I raised. You will not have, even something like climate change, you won't have a real success in combating climate change if you don't deal with poverty, because many poor people in poor communities live on the fringes of major tropical forests, just to give you one example. And if their only source of livelihood is cutting down, or even worse, burning those forests and converting them into farmland, then that will have a major impact on climate change. Similarly, you can't do much about social inclusion if you don't have poverty and poor people as a fundamental pillar of economic justice. So all of these things do connect with each other, but in the policy world, there's a tendency to separate them because you need to divide up problems into actionable chunks. And that's why it's so important to make sure that the anti-poverty programs are maintained and that priority is given to them. And it's not a foregone conclusion. We already have one example where the United Kingdom has decided to reduce the amount of money that it's giving for anti-poverty programs from 0.7 to 0.5% of their national income, and presumably divert those monies into areas that they think are additional or more important priorities. So there's this constant struggle, and we do need to, all of us, I think, fight very hard to make sure that poverty keeps its place as being one of the big priorities, because I think we really can do much, much more to change some of these trajectories. And if I can just close with one word, everything that I put out in terms of scenarios is business as usual. And business as usual is going to leave us with 600 million people in poverty. That's not our forecast of what's going to happen, and it's not what we want to happen. We can do things if we all act together to make that number much, much lower, maybe even bring it to zero. That's what we have to fight towards. We have to change these trends and these graphs. And our purpose of putting out, this is what's going to happen if you just let business as usual continue, is to give urgency to the idea that we have to do something different starting now. Thank you very much.
Homi, thank you so much, especially also for your closing statement. I think it's a very strong statement, very true one. If you don't do anything about it, then this is what's going to look like. So thank you for presenting the numbers, for being here, for so many questions. I said before, there are many more, but I think we heard a lot of insights by now. Also here, maybe to everybody who's listening, I just want to let you know that we have recorded this webinar. So we will share it with you afterwards. We'll share the slides with you as we have seen that some questions go in that direction. So you can absolutely share it also with colleagues, friends, anybody who's interested and who wants to join the fight in eradicating poverty with us. And we want to wish you a great afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are in the world. And again, a big, big thank you, Dr. Homi Kharas, for your time, your efforts, and your insights. It was a pleasure having you again.
Thank you, Reka.
Thank you. Bye.